Welcome to this special Aztlander presentation. Archaeologist Alberto Ruz and his brief life as a Cuban revolutionary. Who knew? With Elaine Schele, PhD from Texas State University. Enjoy!
All righty. Thank you to Jimbo for putting these things together and giving a venue for our scholars to come and talk about their research here. So I also want to thank the members of the Aztlander community, as well as our audience for the opportunity to present some of my research on the fascinating subject of Alberto Ruz Lhuillier's early life. I wish to add that the information and the analysis of these historical events I'm going to share with you here tonight are the result of reading and analyzing scholarly literature on this subject, and in most cases, when it comes to the politics of Cuba and the United States, do not necessarily advance my personal opinions. To see my references and my in-net text citations for this information, please see the original article that was published in the Bulletin of the History of Archaeology, based at La Trobe University. The link to the article is also available in the most recent Aztlander journal. There is also another paper I want to mention, co-authored by Ana Luisa Izquierdo and I. It's written in Spanish, and in English, the title translated is Alberto Ruz Lhuillier, Beyond the Discovery of the Tomb of the Temple of the Inscriptions of Palenque, Political Militancy and Maya Archaeology. So she actually brings the history further along than I will in this presentation to talk about the last years where he did scholarship on actually promoting the living Maya. Okay. Now, I should mention that neither in my La Trobe paper or in the Aztlander article did I go into any detail about Ruz's ideas on the application of Karl Marx's economic and sociological principles in regard to the economics and social structure of the ancient Maya. Nor did I mention how Ruz used the theory of Asiatic mode of production to explain the reason for their decline. But I plan to do that here at the end of my presentation if there is time. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to argue that the attitude and beliefs of archaeologists carry into their profession significantly shape the ways they interpret and conduct their work. For this reason, examining an archaeologist's life can give further value and insight into the development of archaeological thought. So, as Jimbo introduced, Ruz was the discoverer of the tomb of the classic Maya ruler Janaab Pakal I, the first at Palenque, Mexico. And for those of you who don't know where that's located, I'm just going to give you a quick look at location map. This is a map I created using GIS of the location of Palenque and all the different water bodies and things around it. And also here is the jungle environment, in case no one has been to Palenque, where the most well-known temples nestle into the jungle. And this is an artistic rendering of the tomb inside the Temple of the Inscriptions that Ruz found as we said, in 1952, and it's from Life magazine. Okay. So it's widely known that Ruz was a Mexican archaeologist of French-Cuban descent. Not so well known are the events of Ruz's early life that led to his decision to leave France and live in Cuba, and then subsequently to live in Cuba, and then into Mexico and live in Mexico. It is well known that Ruz was the first Mexican archaeologist to hold that certification title, and he was the first to graduate from the Escuela de Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, popularly known as INA, which is also there's an E in front of that too. But what was his life like prior to this? As I will outline in this lecture, the obscure events and details of Ruz's life in France and in Cuba before he became an archaeologist helped to explain the so-called anti-gringo attitude that Michael Coe attributed to him in his book, Breaking the Maya Code. Coe believed that this attitude was motivated by Ruz to lead a Mexican boycott of the first Palenque Roundtable meeting in 1973, which was organized by North American scholars who were making advances in ancient Maya hieroglyphs and deciphering them. But I contend that there were additional contributing factors behind this so-called boycott. It is true that Ruz's negative feelings toward the United States, and I have documented this through my interviews conducted with Ruz's eldest son, Alberto Ruz Lhuillier, in 2010. Here you see him standing in front of his father's tomb. This is one of the anniversaries of his death. In these interviews, Ruz Lhuillier told, we call him Coyote, from here on out is what we're going to call him, Coyote. He remembered that there were times when his father would describe the USA as a capitalist monster. In addition to describing Ruz's negative feelings about the US, Coe described Ruz as a Marxist, attributing this to the supposed fact that Ruz's father was the cousin of Fidel Castro Ruz. Coe wrote that this relationship may have explained Ruz's political orientation. However, I have good reason to doubt that there was any kind of kinship between the two of them, and that there are other circumstances in Ruz's past that better explain this anti-gringo attitude. But first, let's address the possible blood kinship between Ruz and Fidel. Remember that the name Ruz, part of Castro's name, comes from his mother's side, Lina Ruz Gonzalez. Angel Castro, Fidel's father, was a wealthy landowner in Cuba, originally from Galicia, Spain. He was married to Maria Agaro, and they had 2 children. But she was not Fidel's mother. His mother was the family cook. Lina Ruz Gonzalez, Fidel's mother, was 15 years old when she started working in the kitchen for Angel. She was 30 years younger than Angel. While still married to Maria, Angel began fathering children with Lina. They had 7 children. It is said that Lina was a native Cuban, but from a very poor family and could not read or write until she was an adult. Angel finally married her after the death of Maria. I have serious doubts about any connection between Lina Ruz and Alberto Ruz's family, since Alberto's family had been part of the landed gentry. But that was over 150 years ago, when Alberto's family had their plantation in Cuba. And family situations do change. Perhaps on the poor side of the family, but there's a remote possibility of kinship and not enough evidence to claim so. However, in my interviews with Alberto Ruz's son, Coyote, I was told that his father would jokingly call Castro Tío Fidel. And here you see a picture of Coyote with his rainbow emblema from the Consejos Divisiones, Guardians of the Earth. By the way, he was using the symbol of the rainbow before it was adopted by the LGBTQ community. Coyote died of cancer in 2003 at the age of 78. Another thing that Coyote told me, however, is that when he and his father visited Cuba in the 1960s and 1970s, the elder Ruz was treated like royalty by the Castro regime. How interesting. But remember that Ruz was at one time related to Antonio Gutierrez by marriage. Antonio is a national hero in Cuba, so that by itself would have given the Don Alberto special privileges in Cuba. In addition, Alberto had been involved in the struggle to free Cuba from the tyrant Gerardo Machado. I will go into more detail about this later in my presentation. I want to pause a moment to say a few things about Coyote. Since he was an invaluable informant for my research, as well as being a good friend. He was born in Yucatan and was a writer and activist dedicated to social change, environmental sustainability, and the performing arts and he co-founded international theater groups. Mexico's first eco-village, Huehuecail, and the Rainbow Peace Caravan that promoted permaculture and sustainable design across Latin America and the world. His work received international recognition, including receiving the Escuela Viva Prize awarded by the Brazilian president. In later years, he held cultural and environmental leadership roles in Mexico, advised on the law of rights of Mother Earth, organized global forum on the subject, and traveled worldwide as a keynote speaker advocating the Universal Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth. He stood as a fierce, generous guardian of Mother Earth, leading with courage and love so the people, land, water, and our future could be sustained. So that's Coyote. Okay, I think that Alberto Ruz in the end would have been proud of him, although they did have some problems with their relationship and when he was coming of age. So now back to the subject of Ruz's anti-gringo attitude. One of my goals in this presentation is to demonstrate to you why there is so much more to understanding Ruz's political and sociological leanings than an undocumented sanguine relationship. Another of my goals is to convey to you just how much pain and suffering the Cuban people have been through for at least over 150 years, and even longer if you consider the indigenous people. So now let us explore Ruz's family history and his early life. Ruz's ancestors, excuse me, and his family participated in the founding of the Spanish colony in Cuba. And since then, excuse me, had been part of the landed gentry in the area of Santiago de Cuba. His grandfather was named Jose Ruz Amores and was born in Havana in November 20th, 1830. He was, as I said, a wealthy landowner. He had slaves, he even had slaves, who grew sugarcane and coffee in Cuba in the 19th century. In addition, Jose was a distinguished doctor in Havana and vice president of Cuba's Academy of Medicine and founded Cuba's Academy of Sciences in 1861. He was also described as a poet, a translator of French poetry. I will give you a short history as to why the family left Cuba. It had to do with what is called Cuba's 10 Years' War. The conflict, also known as Cuba's First War for Independence from Spain, began on October 10th, 1868, when Carlos Manuel Cespedes, a revolutionary leader, wealthy sugar mill owner, declared independence from Spain. His call to arms inspired many other landowners to join the cause. Cespedes not only proclaimed independence, but also freed his enslaved workers and urged them to fight in the revolutionary struggle. At the same time, Ruz's grandfather likewise emancipated his enslaved laborers, a decision that angered many of his fellow plantation owners. They were worried about mutiny, and they wouldn't have any workers. The upheaval, after the rebellion against Spain, the upheaval and repression that followed created widespread instability, forcing numerous Cuban families, including the Ruz family, into exile. They left the island in 1869, and eventually they settled in Paris. An interesting detail about the founding father of Cuba, Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, mentioned above, is that his son, Carlos Miguel Cespedes, will become the provisional president of Cuba later on in 1933, following the ousting of dictator Gerardo Machado. He served for 24 days before being thrown by military revolt, and I'll talk about that later. So, after leaving Cuba, the Ruz family, eventually settled in Paris in a district called Cubalandia, a neighborhood of Cuban exiles. It was here that they waited for and received news of the Cuban insurrection of 1895, the country's second Revolutionary War. Jose remained a staunch supporter of the Cuban independence and wrote articles in opposition to Spanish colonialization in the newspaper La República Cubana under a pseudonym. So Ruz came from a family of writers. Eventually, Francisco, Ruz's father, studied dentistry and became a dental surgeon. Both Francisco and his father Jose were active in the Cuban community and continued to denounce the Spanish domination of Cuba. Francisco became distinguished as one of the most active proponents of the Cuban Revolution. Through his writings, he helped to inspire the Second Revolution. Eventually, he married a French woman named Luisa Lhuillier, and they had 4 children, with Alberto as the oldest. The family still owned land that they inherited from Jose in Cuba, but they feared that it was no longer recognized as being theirs. Okay, now talking about Cuba. According to Harry Frank Guggenheim, who is an American businessman, diplomat, publisher, and museum philanthropist, throughout the history of the United States, Cuba has occupied a place of peculiar, if unrecognized, importance to our foreign affairs. No other country has so continuously concerned our Department of State. And it's still the case, isn't it? Okay. Even though the family left Cuba behind, I gotta go back. Even as far back as the time of the presidency of the liberal Democrat Thomas Jefferson, Cuba was regarded as the new American Republic, for the new American Republic, its desirable U.S. territorial acquisition. Such desire was created in part by the island's economic potential and future importance to trade, and also by its proximity to Florida. In 1820, Thomas Jefferson thought Cuba the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states, and told Secretary of War John Calhoun that the United States ought to take Cuba at its first opportunity. Furthermore, President James Madison, Jefferson's successor, viewed Cuba as a potential fulcrum from which others could do harm to U.S. commerce and security. Even though the family had left Cuba behind, the country and its history would one day play an important part in the life of young Alberto Ruz. I will now go into the history of U.S. relations with Cuba so that you can get a better understanding of why Alberto Ruz would eventually see the U.S. as an imperial monster. During the mid-1800s, while Cuba was still under Spanish colonial rule, the U.S. continued to be an important influence on its affairs due to the close proximity. The Cuban War of Independence, also known as the Second Revolutionary War, as I mentioned above, was Cuba's final and decisive struggle against Spanish colonial rule. The conflict began in 1895, reigniting long-standing demands for independence. It was led by nationalist figures such as Jose Marti, whose vision combined political freedom with social reform. Marti and other revolutionary leaders sought to unite diverse sectors of the Cuban society in a coordinated effort to overthrow Spanish authority. Spain responded with severe military measures, and General Weyler implemented harsh policy of reconstruction, reconcentration, I should say, forcing rural civilians into guarded camps in order to ensure insurgents from popular support to isolate them. These concentration camps led to widespread suffering as overcrowding and disease and hunger, massive civilian deaths happened. Reports of these conditions stirred outrage abroad, and particularly in the United States, where anti-Spanish sentiment grew rapidly, and there was rebellion. As I stated above, the rebellion was led by Jose Marti and others. Here's a picture of him. He was very young. But Marti was killed in the rebellion, and his death fueled the fire of the hearts of the Cubans for independence. He was a Cuban nationalist a poet, a philosopher, an essayist, a journalist, a professor, and is considered Cuba's national hero because of his role in the liberation of his country from Spain. So while this War of Independence from Spain was going on, President William McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana to protect U.S. interests during this Cuban revolt against Spain. It exploded the boat, USS Maine, on February 15th, 1898, while it was in dock. The Americans thought that Spain did it by planting an explosive mine. But later it would be decided that it was an internal accident. Ever heard of the saying, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain? This is where it came from. It became a rallying cry, pushing the U.S. toward conflict. Driven by economic interests and humanitarian concerns over the brutality of General Wheeler, and then the sinking of the Maine, all led to what we call the Spanish-American War. It lasted only 10 weeks, and after the Treaty of Paris was signed, the U.S. officially granted Cuba's independence. But it was the U.S. flag that was raised over Havana, not the Cuban flag. Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba and then ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. This marked the start of U.S. control over Cuba rather than independence, and the U.S. installed a military government. And this is a caricature of the U.S. as published in the Cuban newspaper after the Spanish-American War ended. The caption reads in English, "Keep the island so it doesn't get lost." And you can see Uncle Sam there. So, the U.S. exercised military, legislative, and economic control over Cuba. It was enabled by the Platt Act, passed by Congress in 1901. This generated widespread resentment and recurring unrest. Historians call this the neo-colonial period in Cuba. So yes, the U.S. installed a government headed by General John Brooke, Cuba's first U.S. military governor. This was the beginning of a 60-year relationship with Cuba, where the U.S. would exercise military, legislative, and economic control over Cuba and its people. Between the years 1895 and 1921, according to historians, neocolonialism became institutionalized and repressive in Cuba. Many of the Cuban people, especially the disenfranchised and the poor, resented it. So this gives you a general background of what was happening in Cuba about the time that Ruz was returned to his ancestral land. I propose that this was a very brave young man, but we really don't know if he actually knew what he was getting into. So I want to pause for a moment to talk about where I got many of my images of Ruz that I have shown in this presentation and that I will show. They came from old photographs found in the book Homage to Alberto Ruz Lhuillier, published in 1981 by the Estudios de Cultura Maya at the National Autonomous University in Mexico. Many of the photographs were taken in the 1930s, so the quality of them was very poor at best. So I have taken the poetic license liberty and increased their image resolution, in some cases lighten them so the photos are clearer. Just wanted you to be aware of that. Okay, and this is one of them. Okay, meanwhile, back in France, in 1922, Alberto Ruz attended a business school in Paris. And then at the age of 18 to 21, he moved from Paris to Cuba. According to Celia, the surviving widow of Ruz's fourth and last marriage, he had to learn to speak Spanish because his native language, of course, was French. His eldest son, Coyote, related that one of the major reasons for the move back to Cuba, as I said before, was to reclaim the family property in Santiago de Cuba. Alberto was able to reestablish ownership of the family's real estate situated in the city limits, but they had lost their rural land holdings, in other words, the plantation. While completing the task of getting the land back, Ruz fell in love with Cuba, its music, its Latin American, Caribbean spirit. He decided to enroll at the University of Havana. And here you can see him casually enjoying a view of the Caribbean Sea. So yeah, as I said, Ruz had arrived in Cuba at the beginning of the political upheaval that would last for at least another 30 more years. General Machado, Geraldo Machado Morales, had become president of Cuba in May of 1925. He had the support of the U.S. government and the owners of Cuba's largest sugarcane empire, on which Cuba's economy was heavily dependent. Over time, Machado became an increasingly oppressive dictator, and many of the Cuban people regarded him as a U.S. political puppet. 4 years later, in 1929, the stock market crashed, it triggered the Great Depression, a worldwide economic collapse. As the U.S. economy fell apart, Americans bought fewer and fewer goods from abroad. That alone hurt countries like Cuba, whose economy depended heavily on exporting one single product and one market, sugar, mainly to the U.S. On top of this global crisis, the U.S. government, made things worse with the highly smooth tariff act of 1930. This law raised import taxes on foreign products to protect U.S. farmers and industries from foreign competition during the Depression. Americans in the U.S. began to find other alternatives to Cuban sugar because of the cost. For the Cuban people, it must have been viewed as one more injustice suffered at the hands of the U.S. government. Unemployment in Cuba went up, profits went down, and government workers received pay cuts. Since the entire world was in economic crisis, Cuban tourism also decreased. That was another very important industry. Cuba's casinos and extravagant hotels were empty, and the Pan American seaplanes no longer made regular trips into Havana. This economic collapse accelerated political radicalization. On top of all this trouble, or maybe because of it, Cuban students began to organize increasingly aggressive and angry protests against the Machado regime. Since the 1920s, there's been a tradition of student involvement in politics in Cuba. In their efforts to try to find solutions to Cuba's many problems, the students had been inspired by the examples of the recent Mexican and Marxist-Leninist Russian revolutions. By the middle of 1927, a very vocal directorio of university students had formed, with one of its major platforms opposition to the Machado regime. They accused Machado of selling their country to the U.S., and they wanted to liberate Cuba from what they called the puppet dictatorship and from Yankee neo-colonialism. They demonstrated in front of the university and criticized Machado's continuing efforts to usurp more power. Machado then expelled most of the members of the Directorio from the university. In September 1930, the group again demonstrated, and the police tried to break up the demonstration, and in doing so killed the Directorio leader, Rafael Trejo, causing even greater anti-Machado resentment. After the death, so then Machado closed university, and the student generation that battled the Machado police and administration with, let me go back. Okay, after the death of Machado closed university and many high schools. After the death of Trejo, a majority of the Cubans viewed the courageous student generation that battled Machado's police with admiration and respect. Trejo is still considered a hero of Cuba today. For those who don't read Spanish, the words in the image say, "First martyr of the University Student Federation, the fight against Machado regime, born on a day like today, and who lost his life, at only age 20. So now back to Ruz. Despite all the student turmoil, Ruz managed to attend the Agricultural Engineering Chemical School from 1893 to 1934, a division of the University of Havana. As written in the brochure, and I found this brochure in the Benson Library, believe it or not, that's where I got this photo. As written in the brochure, the school's purpose was to give young people the technical expertise needed to be competent managers of rural properties, able to implement and practice modern methods and procedures in agricultural and industrial crops. There must have been a time in Ruz's life when he wanted to specialize in this kind of work, but all that would change. Now I will introduce you to Antonio Gutierrez Holmes, whose nickname was Tony. In 1929, he emerged on the scene and transformed himself into what some would consider the Che Guevara of that era. Tony became Alberto Ruz's brother-in-law sometime before 1932, when Ruz married Tony's sister, Calixta. Cuban historians have described Tony as Fidel's ideological forerunner. Later in the 1950s, Castro would even implement many of Gutierrez's reforms, his proposed reforms. In 1935, in a story written after Gutierrez's violent death at the hands of the Batista military, which was the regime that followed Machado's, Time magazine described him as a romantic figure who was a little 28-year-old pharmacist with crossed eyes and freckles, with his hair parted in the middle, with a childish open smile and a vocabulary of violent radicalism. I'll say more about his death later. In the early 1930s, and I should also mention the thing about the crossed eyes, he really did have eyes a little bit crossed because he had a brain injury, and one side of, in addition to his eyes being different, his one of his arms was a little bit was a little bit slow. In the early 1930s, Antonio Gutierrez concentrated on collecting weapons to be used in the coming insurrection, and that he hoped would lead to the overthrow of Machado. During this time, he was able to hone his skills as a political and revolutionary leader. This is also the same time Tony, as an immediate family, became an important part of Alberto Ruz's life in Cuba. Like so many other young people in Cuban universities during this era, Ruz became involved in the political protests against Machado dictatorship. I want to pause my story for a moment to tell you where I got most of the information about the personal lives of Calixta, her brother, Tony, and Ruz during this period of time. It was from Calixta's biography of her brother. She wrote it in 1960. There are no documents that indicate whether Ruz became an activist before or after he met Antonio and Calixta and their mother, Teresa Holmes. I believe that Ruz met Calixta, Antonio's sister, prior to 1932, but I do not know the exact date. Both Antonio and Calixta were new to Cuba, and were descended from Cuban refugees living outside of Cuba. They lived in Pennsylvania. That's where they were born. In 1913, the Gutierrez family moved from Pennsylvania to Matanzas, Cuba, in order to improve the health of their father. He had been a university professor in the U.S. Both Calixta and her brother Antonio became students at the University of Havana. Antonio first enrolled in 1924 to study the Department of Pharmacology and Medicine. He actually became a pharmacist. Calixta enrolled in the Department of Philosophy and the Sciences in 1928. Many years later, Calixta would become a prominent anthropologist and write one of the first books in Maya ethnology. And I'll talk about that later. Antonio was expelled from the university in 1927 due to his anti-Machado activities. After his expulsion, politics and revolutionary activities consumed most of his time. As I indicated earlier, Ruz also joined the revolutionary struggle against Machado alongside his peers and his wife's family. According to Ana Luisa Izquierdo, an author who has written papers about Alberto Ruz and who is one of his students, Ruz was first sent to jail after he wrote an article for the magazine Mundo Infantil that denounced the misery of children in the Havana neighborhood of Las Llagas. Izquierdo states that the results of this experience stoically energized him. Subsequently, over the next few years, both Ruz and Calixto were jailed several times and held in the El Castillo del Príncipe and El Moro. Each time, they were incarcerated with political prisoners instead of the common ones, so at least they were in jail with people of similar ideas and attitudes. Thus, the revolutionaries were able to continue planning the revolution from inside. According to his son Coyote, Ruz became very close to this cadre of people. Because of Antonio's activities, Ruz and his wife Calixto were watched closely by members of the Machado regime, especially since all three frequently roomed together. Calixto served time on several occasions at the women's prison at Guanabacayo, as well as other prisons. She told historian Taberas del Real, quote, "I participated in a plan to execute the dictator, was arrested, and they gathered evidence against me. Tony, who had been underground in eastern Cuba, came to Havana and spoke with the witnesses, and he persuaded them not to accuse me. Although the witnesses did not testify against me, I was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Although, along with 13 other women, I was transferred to the jail in Isla de Pinos." End quote. So here she is on the far right. In Cuba during this time, it became very fashionable for young and middle and upper class student protesters to take pictures of themselves in prison almost as though they were on a vacation. Although being incarcerated must have been unpleasant to a certain extent. Here we see Calixto on the far right. On September 12th, 1932, Calixto was released from prison because she had a bad lung and was exiled to France for over 1 year, along with her husband, Alberto Ruz. They did not return to Cuba until September 1933. This visit to Ruz's original homeland was the first time he had returned home for more than 5 or 6 years. Excuse me. Okay. So, after the student rebellion, the death of their leader, Rafael Trejo, and the anger that ensued, President Teddy Roosevelt became alarmed and in 1933 sent Sumner Welles, the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs to Cuba as a special envoy. President Machado's government was divided and unstable. Welles' mission was to negotiate a settlement between Machado and the unhappy leaders of the revolution. Under the umbrella of the Platt Amendment, Welles was able to pressure Machado to step down and leave the country. And by the way, the Platt Amendment was a law passed by the U.S. Congress in 1901 that allowed the United States intervention in Cuban affairs. In Machado's place, Welles then installed Carlos Manuel Cespedes, who was the son of the founder of Cuba, the father of Cuba, in August of 1933 as president of Cuba in an attempt to restore normalcy to the country. But the student protesters regarded Cespedes' administration as a U.S. puppet, and the student directorio opposed him. They also saw him as someone who would slow down the revolution for change. So that is how, on September 4th, 1933, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista, leading an unhappy group of members of the Cuban military, as well as students of the Directorio, conspired to overthrow the Cespedes administration and put into place a pentarchia. Pentarchia is a word derived from the Greek interpretation, the rule of five. It was an executive committee that would temporarily lead the nation, and they would come up with a plan for what to do next. Okay, now back to the subject of Ruz. You may recall that he and Calexa had been deported to France. They returned to Cuba at the end of 1933. The Cuba that they were returning to was still in a state of turmoil. They were on a boat in the middle of the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, when they heard about Batista's coup, otherwise known as the Sergeant's coup. So, the Pentarchia was only meant to be a temporary advisory committee, and it would only last 5 days. Here's an old photo of the members, and you can see Batista on the far right, who controlled the armed forces. I've circled them in yellow. It was made up of 2 university professors, a journalist, a banker, a lawyer, and Batista, with Tony Gutierrez, Secretary of the Interior, who's not pictured in this view. The Roosevelt administration panicked over the coup that overthrew the Cespedes administration and sent warships to Cuba and Key West and did not recognize the legitimacy of this executive committee. Okay. While the Pentarchia was short-lived, the sergeant's revolt marked the rise of this guy, Batista, who became the Army Chief of Staff and the true power behind the government, initiating his long-term influence over Cuban politics. Sergeant Batista was waiting patiently in the background for the opportunity to usurp complete power of the government. He would eventually emerge as the arbitrator of Cuba's destiny for decades to come. He would become president of Cuba from 1940 to 1944, and again from 1952 until his 1959 resignation. But that's a story you won't go into here. Okay. On September 10th, 1933, the Pentarchia was replaced by a government led by Ramon Grau San Martin and Antonio Gutierrez. This one was also an interim government, and was only supposed to last 1 year until they could have a general election. But it only lasted 100 days. Thus, the name is called the Government of 100 Days. It is said that Tony had the brains behind the administration, and Dr. Grau, a doctor and professor of physiology at the University of Havana, became the president by acclamation and appointed his cabinet, with Tony continuing as Secretary of the Interior. It is believed that this appointment was influenced by Batista, Antonio's appointment, in order to placate the students who remained skeptical about the changes. It began to implement radical nationalist social reforms that were opposed to by the United States, Cuban conservatives, plantation owners, communists, and most important, the military. During the Grau and Gutierrez administration, they passed reforms such as the nullification of the Platt Amendment, the setting up of an 8-hour workday, establishing a Department of Labor, opening the university to the poor, granting peasants the right to the land that they were farming, giving women the right to vote, and reducing electric rates by 40%. The electric company was a privately owned American business called Electric Bond and Share Company, by the way. Sumner Wells referred to these proposed changes as communistic and irresponsible, and the U.S. government did not recognize the Grau administration, especially since some of these changes would have impacted U.S. companies owning land and operating in Cuba. However, the government would not be empowered long enough to implement any of these proposed reforms. Years later, these reforms, as proposed by Gutierrez, were implemented by Fidel Castro. According to reports, Gutierrez was liberal, strong, incorruptible, and he had great public support. and was popularly known as the man with only one suit. On September 12, 1933, at the age of 26, Gutierrez began his duties as Interior Secretary, and eventually he would also be the leader of the Army and the Navy and Director of Public Works and Communications. In addition to being Secretary of the Interior, Tony was appointed the Governor of the East, the province where he was the indisputable leader of the revolutionary forces. Here you see Gutierrez standing right next to Batista. And Batista is just waiting for the opportunity to take over. He's got all these military men around him. And I'm not sure what they're holding. It sort of looks like a pineapple, but then it also looks like a grenade. So I don't really know what's going on with that. Okay. 2 months later, in November 1933, Antonio Gutierrez met Dalia Rodriguez. Let's see, where is she? I did skip this one. So sometime during the month of September 1933, Ruz was appointed head of the Department of Municipal Affairs by his brother-in-law, Tony. According to Coyote, one of his father's titles was head of the culture of the Bellas Artes area. But he was never part of the military side of the revolution, always on the social and cultural side. So he was an administrator, is what he was. 2 months later, in November 1933, Antonio met Dalia Rodriguez, also a student in Havana and a member of the left-wing student group. They eventually moved into an apartment together, and then in January or February of 1934, they roomed with Maria Teresa, Felixta, and Alberto. The whole family, including Maria, a housewife, worked for the revolutionary process. Felixta went to work for her brother, the Interior Secretary, full-time, doing whatever tasks he was assigned to her, and then Alberto was busy working as an administrator in the Grau Gutierrez government. Dalia also helped Antonio, fulfilling the task given to her by her brother, her partner, and Maria Teresa did what she could to help. This living arrangement would be the last time that the family would be together, because after the fall of the Grau Gutierrez government and Batista's takeover of that government, Antonio Gutierrez primarily lived underground and secretly until May the 8th, 1935. So, what led to the downfall of the Grau Gutierrez administration? There are many factors. For one thing, the government had internal factions that made it more unstable, and those factions were led by students, and even Tony Gutierrez himself, sometimes because they wanted to push the government's social reforms even further than many others wanted to go. Also, it was due to the U.S. opposition to the coalition. According to Cuban historian Jules Benjamin, there were three main reasons for the U.S. opposition to the Grau Gutierrez administration. Number one, it would not act with sufficient resolve to suppress the radical nationalist Marxist insurgencies, which were attacking U.S. property in Cuba. Number two, it passed legislation which inhibited the wealth-producing capacity of the U.S. investments in the island. And number three, it blocked the return to power of the conservative moderate coalition, which had formed the basis of the Cesspit regime, and with which the United States hoped to arrange a new and closer economic relationship. So, on January 14, 1934, Batista forced Grau to resign and installed a president of his own choosing. Within 5 days, the U.S. recognized Cuba's new government, and Batista then became the strongman behind a succession of 6 different puppet presidents until Batista himself was elected president in 1940. From 1925, when Machado took power, until 1959, when Batista was finally toppled by Castro, Cubans did not see any change in their very sad situation. They had high hopes for Fidel Castro, but that too would become a disappointment. But we won't get into that here. The strange coalition between the students and the military had come to an end, lasting only 4 months. After Grau's overthrow, many student activists were disenchanted and with politics, some abandoned their early idealism to find comfort in professional and business ventures. There were others who departed for foreign lands, never to return to their tragic island again. For this generation of students, there was also strong feelings and anger primarily directed toward the U.S. because of the support for Batista. Antonio Guterres did not receive a salary. This is Ruz, by the way, for the position he had held under President Grau, and Alberto Ruz was now unemployed. Here you can see Ruz in 1934 at the age of 28 years. When Antonio left his job as a Secretary of the Interior, the whole family was experiencing economic hardship, so they moved to cheaper accommodations. But without Tony, since he was trying to escape the persecution of the government, it was only rarely that he could manage to visit the family now. They lived modestly. Maria Teresa received her husband's pension of $60 a month, and that was their only income, city income. Calixta was studying, and Dahlia, Tony's partner, was stalked and watched by the authorities. She was arrested on several occasions, so she could not work regularly. Alberto was in a similar situation to that of Dahlia, unemployed and suspected of working against the new government. However, he was finally able to get a teaching job. One of the places he worked was the Secondary Institute of Learning at Matanzas. Okay, so what about Tony? Okay, after the fall of the government of 100 Days, he became even more radical and founded a left-wing organization called Joven Cuba, or Young Cuba. He was one of the most uncompromising figures in the group. It was characterized as a proletariat political organization, inspired by anti-capitalism and the nationalism of Jose Marti. In the years from 1934 and 35, Cuba experienced a period of underground insurgency against the rising power of Batista. After the revolutionary upheaval of 1933, it failed to produce lasting structural change. Many radicals believed the struggle had to continue, this time through organized militant resistance. Joven Cuba sought not reform, but the complete overthrow of the Batista regime. The Batista government responded with intense state repression, surveillance, arrests, and military crackdowns targeted to the movement's leadership and supporters. Even though Antonio was still hiding and the odds were against him, he managed to organize a paramilitary group of some 600 members. He was a wanted man by the Cuban government. According to Time magazine, the reason for Batista was hunting him down was because of 3 alleged crimes. Number 1, he shot a treacherous colleague. Number 2, he kidnapped a wealthy Cuban for the fabulous ransom of $300,000. That's a lot of money back then. And he had recently engineered a general strike, which also was against the law. And the $300,000 that his Joven Cuba organization extorted was intended for a planned invasion originating from Mexico into Cuba. Their vision was to eventually ignite the Cuban Revolution of the people, but neither the invasion nor the internal revolt was ever to take place. All of these alleged plans ended when Gutierrez and the Venezuelan named Carlos Aponte, as well as several other co-conspirators, died in a gun battle with Batista's army on May 8, 1935, at the abandoned Spanish fort Morillo in the valley of Matanzas. Gutierrez was waiting there for a boat that was to take him and his companions across to Mexico, where he would seek asylum and would continue making plans for the invasion of Cuba. What you see here are photos of many of the newspaper stories about their deaths. The caption on the lower right image reads, "This photograph taken by Generoso Fuencasta was published in the magazine Carteles on Sunday, May 12th, 1935, and shows the bullet-ridden bodies of Antonio Gutierrez and Carlos Aponte lying on a table in the morgue with Corporal Abat and several soldiers behind them. So that's what happened to Antonio. So Alberto and Calixta, who were in prison at the time of the shooting, were subsequently given two choices by the Batista government: death or exile. Thanks to the very liberal immigration policies of Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas, they left Cuba for a new life in Mexico, and Teresa went with them. In 1938, Ruz enrolled in what would eventually be called the Escuela de Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia and began his career in anthropology and archaeology. The transition to a more normal life, quiet life, must have been welcome, but memories of those struggles in Cuba would have been hard to forget. Calixta got a job teaching English, and since she was fluent in both English and Spanish at the time, at the same time, Ruz was also, as I said, he also entered into this school, and she did too, the year after he did, the same school. Upon graduating, Calixta conducted fieldwork in Chiapas, Mexico, where she interviewed residents of Maya village of San Pedro, and during this time, she stayed at the home of archaeologist Franz Blum and his wife, Gertrude, in Casanam Balam in San Cristobal de las Casas. Using this research, she wrote Perils of the Soul, published in 1961, which became the most prominent Maya anthropology book of that period. Calixta always had the idea that one day she would return to Cuba when the uprising came, which she was talking about Fidel. And she finally moved back after Castro took office. She was one of his advisors. Okay, now this is an image that our friend Nick Hopkins sent to me of a picture of he and Calixta, as you can see. Her nickname is Callie, and is Nick Hopkins listening? Is he in our? You want to? If he's here, perhaps he wants to make a statement about this picture.
Yeah, no, he's not here.
Okay, very good. Anyway, it was nice of him to send this to me. I thought it was great. And see, they were all anthropologists working on a project, and yeah. So, okay, so. Okay, to this day, Tony is celebrated as a revolutionary in Cuba. For example, this Cuban postage stamp was issued commemorative of the 50th anniversary of his death, along with the Venezuelan who died with him. Okay. Now, so back to Ruz, after personally experiencing and suffering the consequences of the actions of what he considered U.S. puppet dictators in Cuba, there's little wonder that Ruz harbored bad feelings about the U.S. government and perhaps its citizens. However, Ruz did eventually overcome these feelings. When he became director of INA's pre-Hispanic monuments of the Southwest, a geographic area that included the present-day states of Chiapas, Campeche, Quintana Roo, and Yucatan, he made friends with many anthropologists and archaeologists from North American institutions, including people such as Sylvanus Morley, Eric Thompson, Franz Blum, and Gordon Eckhom, as well as Yvonne Watt. Additional evidence of their friendship was recorded in the interviews with Coyote, who remembered as a child, and this is him as a child. And this is, of course, Ruz, the elder Ruz with Blanca, his first wife, or his second wife. Oh, no, actually, she's his third wife, now that I think about it. Okay, so additional evidence of these friendships was recorded in interviews with Coyote, who remembered as a child growing up in Yucatan. Each of these individuals was welcomed into the Ruz home as guests and stayed overnight. And when Ruz's family went to the United States, those same individuals were happy to return the hospitality by accompanying the Ruz family. But perhaps the most interesting and ironic of all his friendships was the one he developed with Nelson Rockefeller, a member of the great American capitalist family. Rockefeller eventually contributed a total of 40% of the funds that Ruz needed for the excavations he conducted from 1949 to 1959 at the classic Maya site of Palenque, Mexico. Okay, now, how are we doing on time? How long have I been talking?
No, you're doing good.
How long?
Barb Barb McLeod took 3 hours and 20 minutes, her first presentation.
Okay. Okay, well, I just have, the last part deals with his application of the Asiatic mode of production, of Marxist theory, okay? Okay. All right, so for my last slides, I thought I would dwell for a moment on how Ruz used the theories of Marx, particularly Marx's ideas on the Asiatic mode of production, to apply them to the ancient Maya society and economy and their eventual decline. But before I do, I have to talk about the context related to when and where he addressed those theories. He only publicly lectured or talked about them when he was in Cuba. This is the front of the cover of the 68th issue of Cuban magazine called El Cayman Barbudo, meaning bearded cayman. Inside is an article that he wrote based upon a series of lectures on the ancient Maya that he gave to students and faculty at the University of Havana in 1972 or 73. This is a magazine about Latin American culture. It's still published today. It's under the patronage of the Cuban Communist Party and the Union of Young Communists. So this is one of only two places where his thoughts about this theory were published. Take note that the images you see in the middle of these two windows or doors seem to have been created in the Aztec Codex style, not Maya. However, if you look closely, you might be able to make out the very clumsy drawn Maya glyphs that frame each image. It's a very poor quality image, even though I did enhance it. Okay. The only other published paper that documents his theories on this downfall of the ancient Maya was the Estudios de Cultura Maya in 1981, 3 years after his death. He titled it, or whoever published it, it may have been his wife that gave it to them. He titled it A Tributary Mode of Production in the Maya Area, but it's in Spanish actually. So why is it that he never lectured or published this theory in the US, Europe, or Mexico if he believed this theory was if he believed it so strongly? I believe that I have the answer. Many of you are old enough to remember that the Cold War was an ideological and material struggle between the West and the Eastern Bloc countries that began around 1945. It had many manifestations and consequences for the lives of people all over the world. On one side of this war was the supposed evils of communism, an ideology that had developed from the Marxist theories, and Russia was its most powerful proponent, and they desired to spread it throughout the world. On the other side were the ideals of capitalism, free market systems of the West, primarily represented by the United States. The US became extremely vigilant and concerned about the possibility of countries in Latin America changing their economic system from free market to communism, and then siding with the Russians, especially when Cuba did just that after the Cuban Revolution, where Fidel Castro took over. This concern continued well into the early 1970s when Ruz was exploring Marxist economic and social theories. And then there came the U.S. war against North Vietnam, which were fighting what U.S. called the Red Threat. And just to mention the word Marxism or communism or Marx was dangerous, and even today the words have a stigma attached in the United States. Therefore, I believe that Ruz would have been reluctant to make his academic application of Marxist principles known to Mexico or to the North Americans. Okay, so let's talk about Marx's principle first. So what were these economic and social theories I spoke about? Again, I need to give some context about how Marx came up with this theory. He had studied the British reports from the 19th century where he had documented the old and great civilizations of India and China. And that was why he used the word Asiatic to emphasize a stagnant society lacking private property, feudalism, or capitalistic development found in Europe. So, Marx believed that societies all over the world develop similarly, sort of like an organism, and that they share economic and social characteristics, such as an absence of private property. So most of the land was collective agricultural land. Laboring classes were organized into villages, and they were the primary producers. The peasants were enthralled with the ruling class that lived in central cities and who laid claim to most of the production of labor. No feudalistic decentralization, lords, or capitalistic development. Highly centralized state that exacts surplus from villages. There's another drink. The villages were politically oppressed and economically exploited. So how did Ruz apply this theory to the ancient Maya social and economic system? First, I want to emphasize again, the ideas I will present here are not my own, but they are Ruz's, and I will try my best not to interject my own opinion about his ideas based upon current research. In other words, I'm not going to say whether his ideas are right or wrong. Some of these proposals are going to be obviously outdated, but those of you who study the Maya. I also need to mention that keep in mind that Ruz wrote this in 1973, and the audience for which he actually did the lectures was communist state, the scholars, Cuban scholars who were under the communist state. Okay. The use of analogy, that's what Ruz did. That's what many anthropologists and archaeologists do in order to try to understand the behavior of a culture where there is no written record. And of course, this is before the glyphs had been deciphered. Ruz uses this method to apply Marxist theory to Maya. And remember that Ruz's paper was written before the Maya glyphs had been deciphered in any substantial way, except for the calendar glyphs. Also keep in mind that this was during a time when most prominent Maya scholars believed that the Maya glyphs were only about the calendar and not about gods, the calendar, their gods and astronomy, not about history. So Ruz is using a culture's economic and social system that is documented and well known in Asia, and then making inferences from that about one that he didn't know, the ancient Maya. That is what Ruz did in these two papers as he was trying to understand Maya's history. Okay, so first of all, in his article, he complained that most of his cohort archaeologists shied away from addressing economic aspects of ancient Maya, and he thought it was important enough that he wanted to address it. He argues that most classic Maya studies were deeply idealistic because they focused on religion, art, writing, cosmology, while ignoring economic and social foundations of Maya civilization. He specifically mentions Sylvanus Morley, George Brainerd, Eric Thompson as scholars who advocated this approach. These scholars portrayed Maya civilization as a deeply spiritual and harmonious society, one guided primarily by religious rather than material or economic conditions. In this interpretation, social tensions and inequities were minimized or ignored, and the civilization was imagined as largely unified in purpose and belief. According to this view, peasant communities supposedly enjoyed ample free time and participated willingly in the construction of temples and monumental architecture, contributing their labor voluntarily as an expression of shared religious devotion. These same scholars often explained that the Maya collapse not as a result of the internal social, political, or economic contradictions, but the consequence of outside influences, what they described as the arrival of exotic ideas from beyond the Maya world. Ruz strongly rejected this interpretation, criticizing it as naive, romantic, and fundamentally unscientific. So at this time in history, scholars, including Ruz, believed that there was a central paradox and a contradiction in our understanding of the ancient Maya history. The fact that it had a very low agricultural technology, such as slash and burn farming, and no use of the wheel, and yet they produced extremely high cultural and intellectual achievements, such as sophisticated calendar, writing system, astronomy, architecture, etc. We talked about that. Ruz insists that the Maya were not an exception to historical laws, but follow universal patterns of social development and exploitation. According to Ruz's interpretation of the ancient Maya economic system, Maya society originally began as largely classless. Land and agricultural production were held communally. Most crops cultivated and shared by the community as a whole. Two important exceptions were cacao and henequen, which were controlled by the emerging merchant class, suggesting early distinctions in access to valuable resources. Over time, a theocratic state developed that claimed rights to the surplus labor and agricultural production of the common people. While peasants worked the land, the excess they produced supported the ruling and priestly classes. This shift marked the consolidation of authority in the hands of religious and political leaders. The elite ultimately held power not only over material resources, but also over the spiritual life of the community. They directed major ceremonies and rituals, participations in which they required the peasantry. In this way, that was required of the peasantry. In this way, economic control and religious authority became intertwined, reinforcing the dominance of the ruling class within the ruling class within Maya society. So here are the major groups. He argues that Maya society was not egalitarian, but deeply stratified along clear lines. As its base were peasant communities who held land communally and worked it collectively. They produced food that sustained society, generated the agricultural surplus on which the entire system depended. Yet their central economic role they bore was the heaviest burden. They were required to provide labor, service, tribute, giving up significant portion of what they produced. Above them stood the ruling class, the priests, the nobles, and administrators, who monopolized knowledge and authority. They controlled the calendar, astronomy, ritual life, sacred knowledge, presenting themselves as indispensable mediators between the gods and the people. Through this claimed divine intercession, they justified the collection of tribute in both goods and labor. The elite directed monumental construction projects, temple building, and hydraulic works, organizing large-scale labor drawn from the peasantry. Religion functioned not only as a belief, but as an ideological tool that reinforced elite authority and normalized inequity. Ruz characterized this arrangement as a system of super exploitation. Let's see if I have. Yeah. Sorry, I skipped those two slides. Okay. Ruz characterizes this arrangement as a system of super exploitation. Tribute was framed as necessary payment for the ruler's spiritual services, but in practice, it extracted surplus from the producers in a sustained and systematic way. Over time, the ruling class consolidated its control, becoming what Ruz described as a parasitic bureaucracy, living off the labor of others while claiming sacred legitimacy. For Ruz, this social formulation did not fit neatly into categories like slavery or feudalism. Instead, he sees it as a traditional class system, a structured hierarchy rooted in communal agricultural production, but dominated by increasingly powerful and exploitive elite. Okay. So yeah, the ruling class didn't just hold political power, they even directed crops were planted by controlling the calendar itself. Agriculture, foundation of the daily life, moved according to their authority. Aside from the prisoners captured from other cities, there weren't individual slaves in the usual sense. Instead, the common people were bound to the state, owing their labor and loyalty to it rather than to private masters. So the people were the slaves. Over time, these forces combined to concentrate power more tightly until the city effectively became a private domain of a hereditary autocracy passed down through the generations. Let's see. Masons, artisans, and merchants formed part of this layered upper class, occupying positions of privilege within highest elites, but still above the common villagers. Some of this is repetitive. So as a result of all this, the society was shaped by deep and persistent tensions. The needs of the peasant villagers focused on survival, family sustenance, and local stability were fundamentally different from the priorities of the wealthy, who sought to expand power, accumulate surplus, and maintain their authority. These conflicting interests created a system marked by inequity and underlying strain. So, he argued that based on the research available at the time, the Maya world experienced a major upheaval in the 8th century, a revolution led by agriculturalists against the ruling elite. He believed this social conflict left visible traces in the archaeological record. The deliberate mutilation of monuments and the evidence of cities being sacked, in his view, were not random acts of destruction, but signs of a broader political and social uprising. According to this interpretation, the collapse of the great ceremonial centers forced the Maya population to disperse into the surrounding jungles where the Spanish later arrived and encountered the Maya. That's where they were, living in communities, small communities, in rural areas, in decentralized settings. Okay, so he argues that religion was not the force that created Maya society. Rather, Maya society created religion as a way to justify systems of exploitation. In this view, religious belief functioned as an ideological tool that suppressed existing social hierarchies. The elite used astronomy, complex calendars, even prediction of eclipses to discipline and intimidate the broader population by presenting themselves as uniquely capable of understanding and interpreting cosmic events. Priests monopolized specialized knowledge and used it to maintain social and political control. So yeah, the Maya were not a mystical exception to history. They followed universal social laws. A society with low production forces but a powerful ruling state can achieve great cultural heights by draining the labor of the masses. Their brilliance was not based on was based on systematic exploitation, not spiritual harmony. And that's the end of my talk. Okay.
All right, Elaine, that was really, really good.
Oh, I'm tired.
Very well researched.
Thank you. But thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me see. I didn't see any questions You've
Okay.
entertained everyone so well and done such a good job. Nobody has any questions in the chat. Is there anybody who would like to ask them questions? We got a few students here tonight. It looks like they're getting extra credit or something for watching your program. But Kalau, it's been nice interacting with you. If you have any specific questions or something, please unmute yourself and ask Elaine. Here's a person coming in an hour and a half late.
Oh, I see Ana Luisa Izquierdo. I had, hi there. I had mentioned your paper, our paper, our co-written paper earlier. Actually, it's in the, I want to remind everybody, it's in the chat. I'll get to it. Yeah, my first comment. Hi.
Hi, yeah, it's Carl, and I just thought, what a timely presentation as the U.S. Prepares, actually to get more involved, if not invade Cuba.
Yeah.
Reminder of the history between the history and the history of exploitation between the United States and Cuba. So that was, quite a reminder there. And then could you maybe explain a little bit more about Ruz did not attend the original Mesa Redonda, right?
Mhm.
At Palenque. So
He was invited, but he didn't go.
his history and his staunch opinions was a part of that decision, and because he was just right there on the cusp of opening up all that history and the and new decipherment, yet he chose to not attend. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Well, it was part of it, but I think there was more to it than that also. If you can imagine, I mean, that was Ruz's, a lot of his life, 10 years of his life there. And, archaeologists sometimes, when they spend that much time in an archaeological site, they start to think that it's kind of theirs and that they want to be the one to find things out, right? They want to be the one to, and I think he was just a little bit, they kind of like that Linda and Peter are kind of like upstarts, and the others, he knew all the others, most of the others. He did send, I think he did send his students, though. He did send his students. I believe, if not the first one, he sent them to the second one. He went to the second one. Actually, yeah, he sent his students the first one, and he attended the second one because he knew he needed to get into the act because they were actually thinking they were believing that they were doing something. And I'll get into that. That's a whole other story. It's a whole other paper I wrote about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question.
Sylvia, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Oh, hi, everybody. I had a quick question. Did he go into did he study like the different migrations of the Mayan at different time periods that maybe that would be a conflict between them rather than social status or
you mean the people?
yeah, the Mayans, like how there were different migrations into Central America. And do you think maybe new migrations created this new, I guess, violence between them?
You mean that caused their downfall?
Yeah, it's one reason, not just that reason, but did he go into that or?
Oh, he really didn't go into anything about migration. So
would that be a cause, like a reason why the different Mayan groups that migrated in different periods caused the downfall of the Mayans? Because they're different different Mayas.
Right. They generally tried to stay in the same places, but it depends on the period of time that we're talking about.
Yeah, that was my question. Like, did he go? Did he study that? Is that would be a reason why that was one of the main reasons the downfall of the Mayan societies?
Not to my knowledge. No, not that.
Okay, because I have a friend, he's Mayan, and that's what he like. They say he says that his people say that there were more conflicts between other Mayans than rather than their social status. Like if there were peasants and elites.
I mean, internal.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. They fought each other. Is that what you're asking? And then
well, yeah, because there were different Mayans. It wasn't just the Nam people.
Yeah, it wasn't the internal. Well, yeah, that was something that they didn't know that much about. You know, the hieroglyphs helped us to understand what the invasions or what the not necessarily invasions, but the
migrations
wars between the
yeah.
wars between, and so yeah, but he really didn't address that. It was too early because he didn't really know that much about. You know, now we know that there were power struggles between city states, but I don't think that they knew enough about it in '73 to come up with that.
All right. So that was my question. I'm sorry, I'm kind of new at this, so I'm trying to word my question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Sylvia, do I have you in my Aztlander email files? Because we got a lot to teach if you need a lot to learn. You could send me your email address and address to Jim Reed, host.
Oh, okay. I don't remember if I'm in your list.
Well, do you get the issues, or how did you get this program announcement?
Well, I first got you I found out about you through Elaine in her Facebook.
I'm on Facebook.
Yeah, on Facebook.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead, give me your email address in a chat post to me.
Okay, all right, sounds good.
All right, and K Graph has a question, Elaine. Can you contrast Ruz to Simon Martin's book?
Oh my goodness. No, I'm really not prepared to compare Ruz's theory to other, except to say a lot of it's outdated. So I haven't really, I haven't actually read. Which Martin book are you talking about? Simon Martin. Are you talking about the Chronicles of the Martin, or are you talking about the latest one, which is right over here, Ancient Maya Politics? Are you talking about Ancient Maya Politics?
He is muted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I don't know.
Okay.
Classic period decline, yes.
Oh. Well, as the discussion was just a moment ago, Ruz thought it was internal struggles. I don't even know how much. I don't even, in terms of city states, I think that he realized that there were city states, but he was talking mostly about what he saw in Palenque and other places in Campeche, which is what he was most familiar with. But in terms of comparing the two, I guess the biggest thing would be that he did not, Simon Martin, believed that, and we all realize this now, that they were fighting amongst themselves, and actually the downfall was several factors. Usually when a society falls, it's not usually just one thing. It's like one thing after another. Drought, environmental issues, sustainability, fighting. Perhaps there was disenchantment among the people, and warfare. So, but he did not talk about any of those things. All he talked about was internal revolt is what he talked about. So I guess that would be the comparison.
Yeah, they say they don't have a mic, but that Ruz's work coincides a lot with what Simon Martin has to say recently.
Oh, okay. Okay, very good.
And they say thank you. With the name K-Graph, I don't know if it's a lady or a man. I'm sorry.
Okay, okay.
Might be Karen, could be Ken. Um, so with that, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Does anybody want to unmute and ask a question directly? Well, it does look like K-Graph has a mic. Steve Radsey, Linda, you've been awful quiet. We got Jesus. He's usually in Mexico City. And Kalal, you don't want to ask any questions? He's at the University of Georgia, and he's one of the students that was asked by his professor to attend tonight. Thank you. I met Elaine in Austin one January, and it was a joy to meet you. That's from K-Graph.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, with that, everybody, thank you for attending. Thank you so much, Elaine. A very excellent program. I can see you spent a lot of time on your PowerPoint. So with that, I'll end the program and tune back in on Friday for Michael Ruggeri's program.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Hey, Sim.
Hi there. Sorry I was late.
Yeah, you gotta ask Google. Don't ask AI about time change.
Yes, stupid.
He's in Australia right now. Hey,
Yes,
Nice to
sis.
see you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Okie dokie. Take care, everyone. Thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander, Voice of the Americas e-magazine, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again. Flute music by my good friend, Belizean flutist Pablo Collado.